Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for taking time to join us today. We're very excited for today's discussion about automated vehicles and the role they can play in helping transform our transportation system, moving us closer to a future that is safer, greener, smarter, and more equitable. As we know, AVs have enormous potential to not only improve roadway safety, but also to contribute to more livable and vibrant communities. They can help us work toward equity and economic inclusion by providing transportation needed for those who have limited options, food for those who do not have access to it, and the freedom that comes with mobility for those who are aging and for people with disabilities. On a personal note, this strikes a chord with me as my grandfather was blind. He did not have the benefit of technologies such as AVs to give him the independence he so desired. So the impacts of these technologies can be truly life-changing for so many people, and we have an opportunity to help deliver that. Today, we have a superstar lineup, starting with Nat Buse, Vice President of Safety for Aurora and Chair of ITS America's Automated Vehicle Committee. I want to thank Nat for the fantastic work he's been doing as chair of the committee. His leadership, along with our Vice Chair, Greg Winfrey with TTI, and our ITS America staff, resulted last week in our Board of Directors passing new AV principles that will be discussed today. While Nat will properly introduce our panel and our speakers in a few minutes, I also want to thank them. On behalf of ITS America, a special thank you to Carlos Monge, Undersecretary for Policy at USDOT, and to all of our panelists, Kevin Beastie with Arizona DOT, Dan Corey with AECOM, Salita Reynolds with LA DOT, and Kevin Thibault, Florida DOT, and Desi Lukashevich with Ford. So thank you to everyone for joining us. And Nat, I'll send it over to you.
Hey, thanks, Laura. So happy to be here to kind of present what was a really monumental amount of work by a bunch of dedicated folks for sure. And so as Laura said, today we are officially releasing the association's equity, climate, safety, and infrastructure principles for automated and autonomous mobility. This was developed through our 92-member Automated Vehicle Standing Advisory Committee, as Laura mentioned, which I serve as chair. And I think even on this personal note, as Laura shared her personal story, today I'm out in Palmer, Texas, where I got to see our vehicles driving around on public roads and navigating all sorts of different things. And this technology truly does hold great promise, and super happy that I was able to participate in this group effort for ITS America to really develop these principles. But before we get into them, I want to first take a moment to thank Minnesota DOT, State Farm, Neuro, Phoenix Mobility Rising, General Motors, Washington State DOT, Audi of America, and Texas DOT. These particular companies and the representative took leading roles in the task force that developed the policy principles that we're about to go through. So next slide, please. I'll wait for that to, great. So here we are, 21 years into the 21st century, and AVs present us with this generational opportunity really to reimagine transportation, both in terms of the system that we currently operate, but also in terms of the vehicles that can operate on it. And I think critical to achieving this future is Washington putting in place a national regulatory framework and investments for the physical and digital infrastructure with developers of AV technology and state and local DOTs around such areas as equity, climate, safety, and intelligent infrastructure, particularly as this technology is excitingly moving from pilots to deployment of fleets. And so while ITS America calls on the Congress and the Biden administration to put in place an overdue federal framework for highly automated vehicles, the debates we are having here in Washington do not necessarily reflect what's happening on the ground, where developers are working with city and state regulators to move forward with expanded pilots to full commercial deployment of AVs. There are hundreds of vehicles being tested on public roads across the country, for example. I mentioned we're here in Texas. The California Public Utility Commission has authorized Cruise to provide driverless rides to passengers in its test vehicles. Waymo has opened up its driverless vehicles to all customers of its ride-hailing service in the Phoenix area, which is actually one of the 5th largest cities in the country. ITS America Neuro received the first ever AV deployment permit from the state of California just last year, enabling that company to launch first commercial AV service in the state. And we have more. ITS America member Argo AI is permitted to test in California to also give people free rides. And of course, spending a little bit of time on what's going on here in Texas. There are a number of companies here, but in particular, we just announced that we're doing a pilot with FedEx, hauling goods between Dallas and Houston. And so there's a lot of things happening just with ITS America members in pursuit of getting this technology out there. So we sat back and really wanted to figure out how ITS America could provide kind of a leadership voice in this space to really help inform federal regulations, maybe serve as a guide for state and city leaders, particularly regulators, as they think through their different roles and aspects when it comes to the safe deployment of AVs. And we want to make sure that these vehicles contribute to sustainable, economically vibrant, and equitable communities. So the way we structured the work was really around these principles that you see on the slide here. So it was obviously starts with safety. I'm a safety guy, so there's no accident that one is at the top. But there's these other really, really important aspects. There's issues around expanding transportation equity, more accessible transportation, sustainable transportation, advancing the country's electrification goals, and really modernizing America's infrastructure. And so we'll go to the next slide and start talking about the safety work. So the first principle here is really around improving transportation safety. And so after many, many meetings, lots of debate, we kind of honed in on these main areas that we think are where more work can be done to really advance the cause. So first is really enacting a federal regulatory framework to accelerate and guide the continued safe deployment and development of AVs. I think if you look at the track record in general, when we're talking about true level 4 vehicles or companies that are trying to develop level 4 vehicles, we want to maintain that sort of safe history that we've had as we continue to march forward. We also think there is a benefit, let's say, to establishing a national AV pilot program. And we also think there's some benefit in enacting innovative regulatory approaches. At the underpinning of all that, right, we still have to make sure we're ensuring compliance with federal, state, local traffic laws for sure. And so a couple of things we're asking DOT to do, and I would actually maybe say ask and replace with urge. So one is there's still an awful lot of confusion around public education. And so we think promoting a more comprehensive public education, including awareness of the capabilities and limitations of AVs, is really super important. We urge the DOT to provide NHTSA with adequate resources. Of course, it's funding season in the nation's capital. Cannot do the work without the funding. And so including funding to work with industry, state, and local governments on regulations and laws that may need to be updated to address AVs takes resources. It's not, can't do it in an empty shell. The other thing we thought would be helpful is that there should be a more shared use of AV technology terminology. Really around, again, kind of that public-centered standpoint of definitions that the public can understand. The industry has done a great job writing definitions that they understand. I'm an engineer, for engineers to understand, but those terms really don't land very well with consumers, and something coming out of the department with a broader kind of lens for that broad public is something that could go a long way in kind of helping things. Next slide. So I mentioned we didn't just limit ourselves to kind of the traditional things, and it's no surprise that we're looking at equity as an opportunity here for AVs as well. And so a couple of things we're supporting here. One is this idea of having pilot and research activities in the areas of most need, let's say, or in areas of persistent poverty, obviously within state and local AV testing and deployment sites. Traditionally we've done these pilots, we'll call them in major cities, and not really given the sense of maybe exposing a different segment of the population to the benefits of this technology. One of the other things we think is helpful is to integrate AVs with kind of current pilot programs, particularly ones that are focused on equity. There's many examples of this. So there's a few here, those that provide subsidized access to transit, transit integrated mobility on demand, and mobility as a service programs, and universal basic mobility are just a few that folks can take an opportunity of. I think the next thing we looked at was, well, how would you pick, right? And so one of the things we think that could be beneficial here is kind of developing criteria that one could use to evaluate and prioritize AV pilot program selection, particularly those that were identified in USDOT's Rebuilding American Infrastructure with Sustainability and Equity Grants Funding and Direction. Next slide. All right, so this next area is one that we have often talked about in the past as one of the great promises for this technology is more accessible transportation. And so again, that we worked really hard to come up with what are the things that we think could help. And here are a couple of that I'll talk about. So one is, we think there's a real benefit to accelerating the modernization of federal regulations to allow for the implementation of new vehicle designs, technologies, and capabilities that improve accessibility and equitable access, while still obviously complying with all the state, local, federal rules. One of the things that's really key here is allowing for vehicles that are designed, let's say, from the ground up for purposes such as accessible personal transportation, connections to mass transit, facilitating deliveries. You kind of open up the design space if you can start from, I won't quite call it a blank sheet of paper, but for something that's not designed with traditionally around a human driver. We also support accessible and barrier-free universal design practices for AVs and infrastructure, particularly in ensure that unlicensed individuals are not prevented from using fully automated vehicles that do not require human intervention, and the dissemination of best practices to ensure that learnings from publicly funded pilot programs are broadly shared. Having been in the space for a long time, this is one issue that seems to always come up. I think not necessarily because people are being disingenuous about it. It's just the way that many of our laws written assume certain capabilities, and we really need to broaden our horizon when we think about what this technology can hold. And you have to start working on some of these issues now in order to realize that full benefit. Next slide, please. So one of the exciting things, obviously, is more sustainable transportation. And so we fully support AV alternative and sustainable fuel policies that support and supplement. That's really key. I'll say it again, support and supplement, but not replace high efficiency modes of transportation, such as public transit. One of the other things we want to support is AV policies that will prioritize higher occupancy trips and modes made by AVs that will reduce VMT, and policies that increase vehicle utilization rates, and ones that also decrease the need for vehicle parking. We also think there's some state here where combining AV technology with V2X connectivity can also help to save energy and reduce emissions. So there's a lot here in this particular sustainable principle. Next slide. So of course, electrification is a really hot topic these days, particularly in the transportation sector. And so we have a couple principles here that we like to push on. So one is, we really think Congress has a role here to play. I mentioned in the beginning, like, there are things for everybody to do. And so Congress is not without some things to do. And one of the things we think they can do is eliminate statutory obstacles to electrical vehicle charging on federal aid right away. We also support the development of recyclable and environmental friendly battery technology. There's a lot to be said around how these batteries are produced and where they come from and things like that. There certainly seems to be a need to kind of think about that from a policy perspective. We also think there's policies that should be thought about that really set to encourage, let's say, the wide scale adoption of zero emission vehicles. Of course, there's already a lot of emphasis here, but there's always can do more. And so here, things like maybe tax credits for manufacturing ZEVs or credit for ZEVs that are being shared use. So again, I think you'll see so far, like there's sort of a constant theme of really trying to advance the country down a path of a kind of a more broader support of AV development and deployment. Next slide. And so here we'll talk about infrastructure, which has also been a hot topic as of late. And so this is really the last principle that I'll talk about, and then we can get into a little bit of Q&A. So one is really around expanding our mindset about infrastructure not being just about bridges and asphalt. So here we're talking about increasing digital investments in things like broadband, 5G, other types of intelligent transportation systems, because really these things go, far beyond just supporting self-driving or AVs, but they can also be reused to support human drivers as well. The other thing we think here is there should be some improvements in what's called the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, or the MUTCD, as folks know in the industry. And we think there's a benefit here to having a more prescriptive standard for infrastructure investments that benefit both AVs and human-driven vehicles, since these vehicles will have to share the road for quite some time. It takes a long time for any piece of technology to penetrate the fleet. There are estimates of it's 2 decades plus, and that would be just for one technology. And so we'll have this mixed environment for quite some time, and we need to be open-minded with how we think about that. So just doing a time check on the time, and I think we have a few moments here we can pause for Q&A.
Yes.
If you have a question, just throw it in the chat.
Yes, Nat, there are 2 questions in the chat right now. Let's start with the first one. And the question is, Nat, what exactly do you mean by increasing public education? Just for politicians, I assume that, yeah, politicians or industry, or also including the general public? Yeah.
Really great question. It's all the above. In general, everybody, unless they're spending many hours in this stuff, everybody kind of walks away with a separate framing of what it means to be an automated vehicle. And it's particularly complicated right now because we have companies like mine and other ITS America companies that are testing in the aspirations of achieving level 4 vehicles that can go from point A to point B by themselves, basically, which is different than what consumers have today and can purchase today on many vehicles. Things like traffic jam assist, or these things that are driver aids. But sometimes in the terminology and whether it's just not being very clear, that sometimes those 2 worlds get meshed together. And what we would like to see is a more focused effort to really talk about these as distinct paths, and also the notion that they're not sequential, right? We can have level 2 vehicles for a very long time being on public roads doing whatever they need to do, in addition to having small scale deployments like we have today for level 4 vehicles. And it's up to all of those folks that you mentioned in the question to kind of understand those distinctions and speak clearly about those distinctions, because the public is still very much confused. I mean, I have the opportunity to do a lot of media interviews, and it's still very much confusing even to the media folks that follow this quite a bit. And so it's a necessary thing that we have to do because of the, let's say, conflation sometimes that happens of these 2 technologies. Thanks for the question.
Great, sounds good. And we're going to talk about universal basic mobility in the next session. So I'm going to turn it back to you to go to Laura to introduce the Undersecretary for Policy.
Great. All right. So Laura, back over to you now to introduce our other special guest who I can't wait to hear from.
Very pleased to welcome Carlos Monge of USDOT. Thank you so much, Carlos, for joining us during this very exciting and very, very busy week. I'm sure most of you know who Carlos is, but by way of introduction, he serves as the Undersecretary of Transportation for Policy in the Office of the Secretary. Carlos played a key role during the transition, managing the agency review process for DOT, and previously served as Acting Undersecretary and Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy under Secretary Fox. And in that role, he oversaw implementation of surface transportation programs, the discretionary grant programs, as well as efforts to promote equity and economic development. So without further ado, Carlos, please feel free to turn on your camera and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Laura. Can you hear me okay?
We can, thank you.
Good. Well, thanks so much, Laura, for the invitation to join this event. And I think folks may know that Laura and I worked together in the past on some difficult projects, and always one of the most organized and thoughtful leaders. And it's really wonderful to know that ITS America is in your hands as you take the next steps as an organization. It's also good, I'd say great to be on screen, if not again in person, with Nat, who was a treasured colleague in NHTSA, and obviously did a great job with these principles and bringing the perspective of both the private sector and his extensive public sector knowledge to them. As Laura mentioned, this is my second tour at the department. I first met Secretary Buttigieg on a trip to Northern Europe, and Secretary Fox asked a group of mayors to go with him to visit some of these next generation technologies. And Mayor Pete had deployed the Smart Streets plan in his hometown. He was a young mayor. This is well before he thought about running for DNC chair, much less president. And just seeing him up close and seeing him now as he's taken the helm of the department, I can tell you that he understands these issues really closely. He understands the technology as a way to get a lot more efficiency out of the steel and the concrete that's in the ground now. And he knows the value that can be derived in terms of saved lives, saved time, and stronger communities. That's why now he's been working so hard. He's taking a little bit of time off to be with his new family, but has been hitting the pavement virtually and literally to get the infrastructure deal across the finish line. Late this summer, the U.S. Senate took this step, and to pass a bipartisan infrastructure deal, we had 19 Republican votes on that. The deal contains more than $500 billion in new spending over 5 years to improve our transportation options, to build a network of EV chargers, to connect Americans to high-speed internet, to deliver clean water to millions of families, and so much more. It's the largest dedicated investment in roads and bridges since the interstate highway system. It's the largest investment in rail since the founding of Amtrak, the largest investment in transit in history, American history. Because the transportation sector is the largest contributor to greenhouse gases in the country, we also have to be the biggest part of the solution. I was glad to see that embedded in the principles that ITS has discussed. But what the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act would represent the largest investment in clean energy transmission and EV infrastructure in history. It's going to help build out an EV charging network so that electric vehicle owners can get around confident that they'll be able to find a place to charge. We're also committed to ensuring our transportation system is not only efficient, but safe. We've seen 35,000 traffic deaths every year since 2015, an increase in traffic deaths even as VMT went down last year. These are deaths that can be prevented. These are crashes that are avoidable. We have to make progress, and with this legislation, we will. The agreement invests $11 billion directly into improving road safety, including $5 billion for new Safe Streets for All program that's going to go to local efforts to reduce crashes and to support existing safety efforts, and local Vision Zero programs. It's going to double funding for state and local safety efforts. Importantly, for this group to speed the deployment of technology on the streets, the bill includes $100 million a year for the Strengthening Mobility and Revolutioning Transportation, or SMART program. I remember in the last years of the Obama administration, we gored a lot of oxes to get the Smart City Challenge going for a much smaller percentage of dollars. This is going to be groundbreaking, and we're already thinking about how we're going to deploy that funding. The bill also provides $150 million to improve how states and how NHTSA manages crash data to provide additional insights that are going to help make people safer. The bill is going to help to position the department to safely regulate the rapidly advancing AV landscape. Automated vehicles are part of the future of our nation's transportation infrastructure, and when they're done right, they can make our transportation system safer and more efficient. And I wanted to take a moment to explain some of our guiding principles. The department is committed to supporting experimentation, to sharing insights, to embracing open data and transparency while protecting privacy. And that means sharing lessons learned from both the successful experiments and those that aren't successful. And DOT is prepared to step up and to do this with industry and with stakeholders. Safety is always going to be our North Star, and to help us begin understanding some of the safety implications for the different automation levels, NHTSA issued a standing order, as folks know, to improve reporting on crashes involving cars featuring advanced technology. Being data-driven is important in understanding any emerging technology. The department another principle that's guiding our work is that we will embrace emerging technologies that empower workers and expand access to skills, training, and the choice of joining a union. In all of our critical steps, workers will have a seat at the table in shaping innovation. So to close, we have in the legislation an opportunity for once-in-a-generation investment in safety, equity, environmental justice, resilience, transformation. At the end of the day, this is a jobs plan, and it's going to create an entire generation of good-paying jobs. Alongside the Build Back Better agenda, it's going to add 2 million jobs per year over the course of the decade. I'm actually really optimistic. You know, every news cycle, there's always reason to worry, and the different parts of the Democrat Party are working out their differences. But I've always been optimistic through that, and I think we will very soon see a bill get sent to the president's desk, and we, the department, along with our colleagues across the administration, are working feverishly to get ready for that moment. And we know that ITS America will continue to be a light to help us figure out the way forward. I want to commend you, Laura, and the entire team for putting this event together. And again, great to have to be on screen with Nat, and look forward to the rest of the program.
Great, awesome. Well, Mr. Undersecretary, it is equally great to see you. It's been a while. I want to just say thank you for taking the time. Thank you also for your leadership. I know there's a lot going on in the department, as always happens in the department, but definitely appreciate sort of your continued emphasis on safety and getting this technology out there in a responsible way. So thank you for taking the time again to join us and sharing your thoughts and the thoughts of the Secretary on what's happening. Yes. And obviously, likewise, we look forward to working with you over the coming weeks, months, as time goes on, in a way that we can make sure these policies can actually get some roots, as they say.
Thanks so much. Good luck with the rest of the conference.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. All right. Well, that was a good intro by the Undersecretary, and so now we'll get going into our panel discussion. And I'm super honored to be able to sit with, at least virtually sit with some of these folks and have what I hope will be a great discussion. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves as we get towards the end, but I'm just going to briefly just say who's up for us to. First is Salita Reynolds. So she's the general manager for the LA DOT, just a tiny department. Kevin Thibault, who's from my home state of Florida. He's the secretary of the Florida Department DOT. We have Desi, and I've known Desi for a number of years, and she knows I'm never going to try to butcher her name. So she's the global director of global automotive safety and engineering at Ford. We have a Kevin Beastie, who's from the Arizona Department of Transportation. He's the deputy director for policy. We have also Dan Corey, who's the vice president and deputy national ITS program leader for ITS connected automated vehicles and emerging technologies at AECOM. So maybe in that same order, if folks could go through and introduce themselves and really explain, I think, to the audience, the principles that many of you, all of you, really kind of helped work on, like what you think it means to you and how is it guiding your organization's thinking around the development and deploy of technology. So Salita, we'll start with you.
Great. Thanks so much, Nat. And thanks again for all of your work chairing that committee. That was an incredible cat herding exercise that you executed brilliantly and really resulted in what I think will be some very valuable next steps for USDOT to consider. And the thing I wanted to say about, LADOT manages and operates a street system of about 7,500 miles of streets and alleys. We have a massive footprint inside a massive county in Southern California. And our city looks a lot like many other American cities in that we are still wrestling with the imperfect legacy of the interstate highway system and the impacts that it's had, the inequitable impacts that it's had on people in LA and how they get around. And all of our work in California, and I think at ITS America, on trying to deal with these very pressing issues around existing inequities, around climate, around safety, we're still moving in the wrong direction. And as we look at the deployment of autonomous vehicles, I think there is a huge potential there for us to have at least one tool to help us deal with some of these urgent problems. However, if we cannot all row in the same direction, we might just get more of the same. And that's where ITS America's value proposition of really bringing together the public and private sectors is so powerful and important. As we wrestle with, in particular, safety, and we try and shift from a traditional sort of siloed approach looking at, the traditional E's to a safe systems approach, which really, encourages a shared responsibility for safety outcomes on the street. It is more important than ever that we bring public and private together, that we have shared definitions of safety, that we have shared definitions of equity, that we have shared definitions of even what our roles are in reaching those outcomes. So from my perspective, these AV principles are really critical in order to just get us on the same page from the beginning and have some of these more difficult discussions about the legacy of the system we have and about the risks and rewards of the tool that is coming our way.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with a lot of things you just outlined. I think there's still much work to do, and we need to get more granular for sure. So thanks for that. Kevin, why don't you go next?
All right, I know there's two Kevins, but I think I was the first one you called earlier. So thanks again, Nat. I appreciate the opportunity to participate on the panel and to share Florida's point of view as it relates to the ITS America's AV Standing Advisory Committee's policy principles, as well as how we're preparing for the infrastructure here in our state for the future. So I wanted to tell you that at Florida DOT, we are examining past decisions to determine what changes can be made to address transportation equity and accessibility in the future, and the role that we all very familiar know that AV can and will play. We also know that our industry is evolving and the traveling public expects faster, more efficient, and cleaner transportation options that have been offered in the past. When we look ahead to the integration of AV, Florida has already taken critical steps in that direction. So here in Florida, we have put AV legislation in place that provides more opportunities for the testing of these advanced and emerging technologies. Our legislation allows fully autonomous vehicles to operate regardless of whether there is a human operator physically in the vehicle, deems the automated driving system to be the operator of an autonomous vehicle while engaged, and mandates the consideration of infrastructure and technology improvements necessary to accommodate automated driving systems in our strategic intermodal system plan, among other provisions. As many of you know, you talked about Nat being from this great sunshine state. Florida is a very diverse state where urban, suburban, and rural areas, each with completely different transportation needs. Differences aside, though, transportation is the commonality that supports and stimulates the economic growth statewide and provides our residents with a strong, good quality of life. So the vulnerable road user safety is an important facet that we look at here at the department. We have developed several projects in key areas of the state to move the needle in this area. Florida's safety vision is to eliminate transportation-related fatalities and serious injuries for all modes of travel, and has established a target of 0. To move forward to that goal, the department follows the safe system approach, as Salita just mentioned, and works with many partners to take proactive steps to identify and mitigate the risks within our transportation system. So again, Nat, glad to be here and glad to be a part of this panel.
Great, Kevin, and thank you for representing the Sunshine State awesomely. All right, Desi, how about you?
Thank you, Nat, Laura, and the entire ITS America community for enabling this wonderful discussion amongst this group of industry panelists. I'm Desi Vikashevich, as Nat said, and I lead the Global Automotive Safety Office for Ford. Delivering a smarter, safer, greener, and connected mobility ecosystem is such an important journey for all of us. This is such an exciting day for Ford, as today we announced our plans to lead the electric revolution. This announcement, coupled with today's focus on AVs, is a real inflection point in our industry, and together we can make a difference. To Salita's point about a shared vision, that's just such an energizing opportunity. The real world safety opportunities that AVs bring are tremendous. We can use the published safety data to remind us how important this journey really is. In 2019, over 36,000 people were killed on our US roads. That number further increased in 2020, even though as a whole, fewer miles were driven due to COVID. This is a real call to action. The unexpected increase is attributed to driver behavior like speeding, impaired driving, drowsy driving, or even being distracted as a whole. This should be a cause for concern and is a further reminder of the important role a driver plays in road safety, and obviously an opportunity as we imagine a future with AV technology. Today, like Nat mentioned at the start, Ford and others are actively developing and testing autonomous vehicle technologies for American roads. AVs have the potential to transform road safety because the automated driving system, or ADAS, is always alert and is constantly learning from its environment to improve the safety outcomes. Further, AVs can improve mobility for underserved populations, including older citizens and people with disabilities, as mentioned earlier. From an OEM perspective, AVs can also create disruption by challenging the norms and long-held assumptions around design and ownership of an automobile. Ford is evaluating new designs and use cases that will leverage this flexibility provided when there is no driver. And this is the context of many of the material that Nat walked through. We need to think about how we're designing the vehicle without driver controls. Despite their potential to improve safety, there is currently no path for deployment at scale for AVs that are designed without manual controls like basic steering wheels and brake pedals. We need action to update regulations that were previously written and very appropriate with the human driver in mind. Only then can we realize the full potential of AVs. We remain committed to working with governments, agencies, academic institutions, and industry partners like those gathered here today to enable deployment of AV technologies and services that will drive human progress by providing mobility and access to mobility for all. What a wonderful journey for all of us, and I'm excited to be here today.
Thanks, Desi. Really appreciate that. Kevin B.
Thank you very much, Nat. Greetings, everybody from the Grand Canyon State. My name is Kevin Beastie. I'm Deputy Director here at the Arizona Department of Transportation. And I just want to echo a lot of the comments that the previous speakers made. Not only do I serve as Deputy Director here in Arizona, but I've also been a board member for a number of years here at ITS America. And the principles that they've set down before us today to talk about are things that Arizona and the Arizona Department of Transportation support wholeheartedly. Arizona has been involved in the AV space since about 2011. We started very early with some companies that wanted to talk about what the future might look like. And like a lot of people and a lot of organizations, there are a lot of questions. But through partnerships and dialogues and through groups like ITS America and other national groups, we've been able to work through a lot of those concerns and questions and partner together to get to where we are today. Arizona has a number of companies that are testing various technologies here, and we're also home to currently the first, well, absolutely the first, and up until San Francisco starts up, the only fully autonomous ride-sharing platform in the world, where anybody within the city limit, within a 50 square mile in the East Valley, can download an app and get the services that they need when they need it. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation, and I hope there's a lot of good questions out there. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. And yeah, that circa 2012, you just reminded me how long I've been working in this space, and you as well. I remember some of those early days. All right, let's go to Dan next.
No, I appreciate it, Nat. thank you for the time today to you and Laura and for ITS America. Batting cleanup here. I'm going to keep my topic pretty short here so we can get to some Q&A and some of these other topics. I think from the private industry, we're looking at three main things. I think it comes down to the safety, equity, and operations. I think as we talk about AVs, I think having that focus that it's just not the technology, but it is saving those lives. It's how do we get to that zero fatality limit. And I think that has to be at the heart of everything that we do, and every solution we provide has to be to get to zero fatalities. Second, with equity, I believe that it's got to be connectivity for all. And I think it's in conjunction. I think that one of the things that you had mentioned, we're here to support and supplement what's existing infrastructure, transit that's there. Let's help provide that connection, that last mile connection to those existing transit facilities. Let's not create something new. Let's work together hand in hand and create something that's cohesive. And then lastly, operations. Let's look at infrastructure and how data from AVs is going to help reshape operations and how DOTs and others look at roadways and our nation's infrastructure. I think if we take a look at those three issues, I think we'd be on a great starting point. Lastly, I'd love the idea of creating commonality in language. I always refer to it, if my parents or grandparents can understand what we're trying to do here, we can then sell it to everybody. So let's make sure that we're doing, seamless transportation, no matter what mode we're using, and let's put it in a language that everyone can understand and provide those solutions for safety. So I appreciate your time today. Look forward to speaking with everyone, and back to you.
Awesome, Dan. Yeah, thanks for that, and thanks everyone for giving those perspectives. So I have a few questions. We'll spend about maybe 5 or so minutes kind of going through there. So I'd hope the panelists can kind of give their best shot at it so we can get to some audience questions. So maybe Dan, I'll start with you, and I'll kind of bundle these two questions together. So one is, there's always this question of like, what type of infrastructure is needed for AVs? If I get a second most asked question besides how safe does it need to be, it's that one. And I'm curious kind of how you, if you can share with everyone really, your thoughts on what type of infrastructure is needed for like kind of dense city transportation, and then kind of couple with that, since totally take advantage of the environment that we're in. So it is DC. Well, I'm not DC, but Ron is, and Congress in the midst of deciding whether to fund the government, et cetera, and sort of just your thoughts on a standalone AV infrastructure bill. Go for it.
Sure. It's funny when we talk about what infrastructure is needed, everyone, their first reaction is, oh, signing and striping. Do we have signing and striping that's ready to go? And when we look at roadway readiness and an analysis of roadway, you look at geometry and speed and things like that, traffic, changes of lanes. But I think it really comes down to, especially for AVs, and I think a lot of the manufacturers and those on the call today will agree, it really comes back to unpredictability. If we have a vehicle that's, and again, I'm in Philadelphia, so let's take I-95, we're a limited access highway. If you're on an exit and entry points, you basically know what the flow of the traffic is going to be. But when you get to the downtown area, downtown Philadelphia, one who might have to go out and grab lunch, might want to dart out in between traffic. So I think understand that unpredictability is going to be key. And if we look at funding, I think if we put funding working toward, the transit side of life, let's see how we can utilize AVs, in that downtown area where, maybe we start off as a phased approach. We start off, maybe let's start running AVs at night when there's less people. Let's make sure the technology starts, increasing. Let's put funding to where we've got specific measurable outcomes that, yes, you can understand the predictability of Dan versus a utility pole. So Dan could jump out, a utility pole can't. So I think if we look at funding, I think we look at increasing that technology and that technology usage. I also think we tie that into, again, helping to lead our broadband practice. I think that data has to come back to points, whether it's our TMCs or back to the DOTs or back to third parties. So I think we spend some time improving the infrastructure that ties in both AVs, EVs, and then again, sharing data.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. It's not just cars driving on roads, right?
Exactly.
So going to Salita next. So Salita, you correctly mentioned how diverse LA is, and it's very tiny, right? My joke. one of the things, as you know, because you were sort of a voice of reason on this, is folks didn't necessarily tie, at least in the beginning when we started this whole discussion of how equity even fits into this whole conversation. Can you share kind of what you think is needed to ensure equitable access to AVs, and maybe why is it important?
Sure. And I appreciate the question and the attention. And I'll just talk about equity here in two different ways. First, LADOT just did a study on the transportation needs of women and girls in Los Angeles. And one of the more surprising outcomes of that study is that there is a gender gap when it comes to driver's licenses. And there is a gender gap when it comes to smartphone access. And those gender gaps are even more pronounced when you look at other forms of equity. So in Black neighborhoods in particular, there is a clear sort of piling on of all forms of barriers to opportunity. And without a driver's license or a smartphone, it is not clear that we are designing an AV future that will help close that gap. And it is essential that we close that gap, because if those neighborhoods and those folks are left behind, we will continue to struggle with the outcomes of that inequity when it comes to things like homelessness, when it comes to things like persistent poverty, that then show up in all kinds of other ways. These happen to be the same neighborhoods that are disproportionately impacted by severe and fatal crashes, in particular for folks walking, because those other gaps exist. So people are more reliant on transit. They're more reliant on walking. They're more reliant on biking, on other forms of transportation in order to get around. So if what we do is create, and this exists today, despite broad availability of services like Uber and Lyft and other forms of transit, it's clear it's not going to happen naturally. The market's not going to have it to create those equitable outcomes left to its own devices. And that's why it's essential that we come together and take a more expansive definition of what we mean when we say public transit for the public good. What would a fleet of AVs look like that operates as an extension of and sort of an additional sort of support for existing trunk line public transit? And what that means is that the different arms of USDOT and even other agencies beyond USDOT all need to come together, because the federal government is really the only entity that can nudge the market in the direction of those outcomes. So it's clear there's a need there for women in particular, and low-income folks and Black Angelenos in this case, to have access to forms of transportation that don't require a driver's license. But it's also clear that unless we bring government investment into those fleets, they are going to continue to serve higher income and trip-rich neighborhoods, the same neighborhoods that Uber and Lyft serve now. And when I landed the other night at LAX, just to give an example, a trip to my house that would cost me $8 on public transit or $80 in a cab was popping up as $175 on a TNC. So we have to somehow, as we're thinking about, we're so consumed with the technology, we have to be intentional about what kinds of services we're funding and what outcomes we will be rewarding with government investment. So that's kind of that's not even to get into some of the issues around, air quality and other safety outcomes that Black neighborhoods in particular bear the burden of in Los Angeles because they are next to freeways. So if we are just sort of continuing, if AVs are just a continuation of the status quo, then these outcomes won't happen on their own. And if the pandemic has taught us nothing else, it is that our destiny and our fate is bound up together. We cannot continue to focus on the achievement and advancement of one part of the population without focusing on it for everyone. And that's going to require some difficult conversations and some real conversations about the systems that got us here.
Yeah, thanks, Alita, and really appreciate you highlighting let's say a tool in the federal government's portfolio, which is convening power. I think super useful, particularly for this conversation in general. Maybe keeping with that same theme, maybe going to my home state, as Kevin T mentioned, super diverse. I mean, I grew up, we didn't even have public transportation where my house was. I was quoted in the sticks, which it wasn't a thing. And so, Kevin, sort of interested in how you think about, and from a, like kind of a Florida lens that really has been open to AVs, but really how can you talk about sort of the work that's going on with AV equity and accessibilities statewide?
So thanks, Nat. So, the Florida DOT just recently hosted the SASTO 2021 conference here in Orlando. It happened to be the 80th anniversary of SASTO. And so, the whole discussion reminded me about how we talked about the differences in transportation from 1941 to 2021 and what we're going to see from here going forward. I joked and said, I won't be here 80 years from now, right? But how it's going to change so drastically. So we are on the cusp of one of the biggest evolutions of transportation, even though I believe Ford chairman said revolution just recently, Desi. With the emergence of, I'm catching up there, of automated, connected, electric, and shared vehicles. And so when you think about everything that's going on, kind of pivoting from what Salita said, right? We're on the cusp of all this technology, right? Including vertiports, flying taxis, right? Jetsons is like right around the corner, right? But how do we make sure that we kind of keep that equity lens on all the time? So we have recognized here at the department that transportation users need options that have their safety and mobility needs in mind, regardless of their location, like you said, Nat, in the sticks, their age, or their income. So as a result, we have many projects and initiatives currently underway, a plan that will prepare Florida's infrastructure for AVs with a specific focus on equity and accessibility by looking at improving safety for all our modes of transportation, increasing access to the multimodal transportation choices, along with reduced congestion and travel times through micromobility, ride-share options, and so on, especially in our urban areas. So a couple of things I want to really leave with you is our Complete Streets program here at the department. It's the 360-degree approach to transportation planning, design, construction, and operations, focusing on identifying the right solutions for our communities based upon their needs and the desires of all roadway users who live there, as well as how they move in and around the communities, again, regardless of age and ability. Our Smart City Planning is a research project that the department is conducting in coordination with the University of Florida, go Gators, to develop and evaluate community-based methodology for developing transportation mobility plans by assessing the needs of the community. This will allow the department to look at mobility gaps and determine how best to fill them. As you know, as you probably know, Nat, we have been a funding partner for a lot of different groups, whether it be our Commission for Transportation Disadvantage, our transit agencies, our NPOs, and additional community providers across all parts of the state to serve residents with mobility options that are not only available and accessible, but also affordable. So finally, I wanted to take this opportunity to say, as we shift from gas-powered vehicles, we will need to ensure that there is adequate funding to prepare and maintain our transportation infrastructure as well. So in addition, our rural areas will need much of the same supporting infrastructure that today is typically found only in our urban areas. So we really kind of looking at all aspects of it now.
Yeah, that's great. And that actually is a great segue to kind of kick it over to the other Kevin, because one of the questions that came in was, why so much focus on safety and equity? I'm paraphrasing here, but the point of the question is like, if it's safe and equitable, we have no plan to live in, kind of what's the point? And so maybe Kevin, can you talk about Kevin B, that is kind of the removing regulatory obstacles for EV charging on federal aid interstate highways? And that has been an issue here in the DC area for a while now, continues to plague the infrastructure bill. And so obviously the current debate centers on EVs, but kind of maybe you can speak to a little bit of this AV EV thing and why it's important for AVs.
Sure. Even if autonomous vehicles and these technologies weren't an issue, the move of our nation and our world towards zero emission vehicles is really revealing some challenges that we have, particularly here in America. Back in 1956, when Congress created the interstate system, a lot of community and local leaders were concerned about, their local businesses, jobs, critical tax bases, shrinking if commercialization was allowed within the right-of-ways. And so to address this, Congress enacted legislation prohibiting any types of commercial services, particularly, and it's spelled out in there, related to automotive service stations or any kind of commercial activity. So at least in my tenure here, I've been at ADOT for 20 years, we've been at the forefront with organizations to try to get that changed, because if you had a roadway that was built after 1960, this prohibition applied to you. That's why you'll see in other areas of the country, particularly on the East Coast, you can drive and you can, drive up into an Arby's or a Starbucks or all types of facilities. If you're on a toll facility, they're also exempt. So, if we're going to move towards zero emission vehicles, and in this case, electricity, Congress is going to have to do something about that, because we have tried every way till Sunday to try to address the needs we have in Arizona with our rest areas and providing services to our constituents and to people who are traveling through our state that other states have. And there is a very, very strong lobbying effort by those industries to prevent that. There's also another hindrance in providing these services in something called the Randolph Shepard Act of 1936. And almost every state has what's called the mini Randolph Shepard Act, I found. And in simple terms, what this means is if you provide any types of concessionary services in a public area, you have to first offer that opportunity to somebody who is sight impaired or blind. So every state has an agency that deals with those types of individuals. So if I was to say I have an opportunity for commercial activity in the building here at ADOT, I first have to go to our Department of Economic Security and say, we're going to open up a cafeteria. And if somebody in that community wants that opportunity, we have to award that to them. We can't charge any rent. We can't get any fees from their services or anything. They have that free and clear. So if you imagine having these types of facilities within right-of-ways, those are going to have to be, unless there's a change to the law, those are going to have to be given to those communities first and foremost. So again, it sounds great. We were supportive of it. We've been fighting to try to get this changed, but it is a large obstacle that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I think very well said. It's not so easy. There's a question in the chat, and we're going to kind of wrap up in a little bit. I know we're coming up on the hour, that I think probably Desi is probably the best suited to answer, and it kind of really speaks to that broader question too about what we as developers should be sharing with the public. And so the question is around machine learning algorithms, and there's been quite a bit of study and papers written around the way you teach those systems. It can actually introduce biases. Maybe can you share to the extent that you can, kind of how Ford thinks about these issues, so that we don't end up with like kind of what I would call a brittle solution.
Yeah, thanks, Nat. It's a great question, and it's probably not only top of mind, but it's a very difficult question to answer in just a few minutes. One of the most important elements, and I'll go back to a question that was posted earlier around trust and creating an environment where our customers not only accept the AV technologies, but have inherent trust in the systems and how the algorithms are developed, including biases that could be in place. One of the things that we're doing is, in collaboration with various academic institutions, is testing our systems, including many developers are doing that. So we take this real world data and continue to teach the system and to build robustness. As part of our trust and advocacy, we published a voluntary safety self-assessment that's available through the NHTSA website. And I would encourage you to go, those who are interested, to go in there and look at some of the specifics on our safety standards and our methodology that we've applied. This continues to evolve. We're working closely in collaboration with many adjacencies to continue to develop the technologies that reinforce that trust, but also to provide public education on what's available and long-term continued partnerships on best practices. Ford is part of the AVSC, or Automated Vehicle Safety Consortium, that was co-founded with Ford. This is a best practice that we were working with SAE to publish many of these guidelines. So without going into all of the specifics, we believe that we can not only create algorithms that are free of bias, but actually could become continuous learners as part of the machine learning that will ultimately deliver safer solutions on the roads.
Great, thanks for that, Desi. Really appreciate that and your mention of the AVSC work for sure, because it's really a lot of good work that goes there. All right, I know we ran up on time. Laura, I'm going to turn it back over to you, but just really want to first thank the panelists and the audience for the questions. I thought that was really, really great. Thank you all.
Yes, thank you. I know we've gone a few minutes over. Thank you for everybody for sticking around. A special thank you to our panelists. And Nat, a great thank you to you for moderating this conversation today. So thank you all, and we look forward to working with everyone as we move forward.